I was going to ask you if you could describe from a psychological perspective what you think cancel culture actually is and where it stems from.
Well, there's a malevolence aspect to it, which is just the delight that people can take in being destructive. And that's part of the whole constellation of, let's say, antisocial behavior. But there's a more subtle element to it, which is reputation inflation. So the most valuable thing you possess by any stretch of the imagination is your reputation. And your reputation basically, I wouldn't call it a status marker exactly. It's a productive generosity and competence marker. And so if you have a good reputation, then people can trust you, and they can trust you to engage in reciprocal productive interactions with them. They can trust you to take their interests into account as well as your own, and to play stable, voluntary, desirable, medium to long-term games. And so nothing is more valuable than your reputation. And what that means is that people try to game the reputation system. And that's what narcissists do, and Machiavellians and psychopaths. They call that the dark triad. There's a lot of research investigation into dark triad personality cluster. And it's a variant of antisocial behavior. And narcissists have the confidence of the competent without the competence. And so what they do is overclaim their contribution. So if you work with a narcissist, everything that goes wrong is your fault, and everything that goes right is their doing. And they will loudly proclaim that, especially to their superiors, and denigrate you like mad if you dare to offer a counter proposition. And narcissists, it's a camouflage strategy in some sense. The narcissist passes him or herself off as a competent and confident person. And one way of elevating your reputation is to claim unearned moral virtue. And so a huge part of what motivates the woke nonsense that insists that the mere reflexive act of feeling sorry for someone constitutes a moral virtue is an attempt to claim a reputational status without having to do any of the work whatsoever to be a genuinely good person. To be a good person, you have to be productive. That's hard. And you have to be generous. And that's hard. And you have to play medium to long-term, stable, voluntary games with other people. And that's hard. That's nothing but diligent, upward-oriented work over years puts you in that position. Whereas if you make a unwarranted moral claim, I'm compassionate, let's say, then instantly you're with the angels. And it also allows you to derogate those who you regard as predatory, let's say, and also enhance your moral virtue. Not only am I compassionate, and that makes me good, and I'm on the side of the angels, but there are the snakes, and they're not in me at all, because I'm saintly in all regards. And so the snakes have to be somewhere. We all suffer from the problem of where to put Satan, that's for sure. And the most convenient place to put him is in someone else, and it's even more convenient if that redounds to your benefit and plays to your political aspirations.
I know a few persons like that, and a lot of them are very active on Twitter.
Yeah. Well, Twitter doesn't bring out the best in people, likely including me.
Would you say this is a more feminine?
It's a feminine style of antisocial behavior. So
cancel culture.
Yeah. Well, there's two forms of antisocial behavior. There's a male form and a female form,
right? Or
a masculine form. That's a better way of thinking about it, and a feminine form, because men can play the feminine ASP game, antisocial personality, and men can play, or females can play the male game. Male antisocial types they tend to be physically violent,
right?
And that's evident at the age of 2 already. So there's a subset of 2-year-olds who are already criminals in the making, let's say. They bite, kick, hit, and steal if they're put among other 2-year-olds. Most of them are socialized out of it by the age of 4. Vast majority, but some aren't, and they tend to be outcasts from then on, because 4-year-olds don't like 4-year-old aggressive 2-year-olds. They won't play with them, and then they get isolated, and then they become bullies and juvenile delinquents, and it's a bad pathway. It's very stable too. It's very sad. It's very sad, actually. But the male pattern is violent, and we don't like violent criminals, and those are the people who tend to be locked up. and a disproportionate number of people, I think it's 95% in prisons are male, and they're almost all violent. We're much harder on petty violent criminals than we are on like the kinds of white-collar criminals who steal the pensions of like 60,000 people.
Right.
And that's not obvious that that's a wise distinction. But being mugged is no fun, so you can understand why that's so stringently controlled. Female violent aggression doesn't work very well.
No.
First of all, girls tend not to fight physically with one another, and certainly girls can't fight. Girls can fight with boys because there's not much difference between girls and boys, say before puberty in terms of physical strength. But once puberty hits, women can't compete in the physical aggression domain, and they're not inclined to either, because they could use guns and knives, but they tend not to. But women have their own underground means of stealing, and they steal reputation, and they're very good at it. And it's very many women and many other men as well who use this pattern of derogation and reputation enhancement.
And is this a scientific fact?
Yes, absolutely. This is a well-developed psychiatric literature stemming back decades.
Right.
You know, I've talked about this publicly several times, and the journalists I talk to are always stunned that how could I possibly propose such a thing? It's like, well, there's a 50-year literature on it. Just because you don't know it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Yeah. And it's reputation savaging and derogation. Mean girls, you can't play with us. You can't sit with us. No, and that's simultaneously a self-elevation and also a derogation of the other. It's very effective and very pernicious and extremely difficult to control. Like, what do you do about it? If you're a girl and you're isolated and shamed in that way, what can you do? You can't really use recourse to authority, because if you go tell a teacher, let's say you're being picked on in junior high, then you're just laughed at because you can't handle your own battles, and you can't bring it to a physical, to the point of physical altercation. You can if you're a man, and that happens very rapidly with men, which is why it almost never happens. It happens almost immediately with men. It's like, what did you say? Do you want to say that again? And any man worth his salt knows how to play that game. And so generally among men, this just doesn't happen. No. Now on Twitter, online, that's a different story, because that pathway of reputation denigration beckons, and social media facilitates its distribution in an appalling manner. And it might be the death of all of us, that. So the incentive structures on the social media platforms, the social communication platforms, are wrong, because the antisocial, psychopathic, Machiavellian, narcissistic types who use reputation derogation are privileged in their communications and not punished. And that's a very bad idea.